Welcome to another episode of Infinite Podcast, folks. I'm here with my co-host Simon, and today we're diving into something pretty wild, reviving ecology. Can nature actually rebound after centuries of radiation? Think about places like Chernobyl or Fukushima. It's fascinating how flora and fauna adapt to these high radiation zones. Isn't it, Simon? What's your take on these unexpected wildlife sanctuaries?
Oh, absolutely wild, Joe. I mean, when you picture Chernobyl, you don't exactly think of a nature retreat, right? But there you go. Mother Nature just bouncing back, throwing a wild party in the middle of a radioactive dance floor. It's like seeing your grandma hit the rave scene. It shouldn't work, but somehow it does. Can you imagine glowing in the dark mushrooms? That's one way to save on your electric bill.
Haha, glowing mushrooms, huh? That's wild, man. But seriously, it's like nature is way tougher than we give it credit for. When we think about helping these areas, what do you reckon? Are we supposed to just let nature do its thing, or should we try to speed up the recovery process? What's your stance on that, Simon?
Joe, it's tempting to want to jump in and play hero, like bringing out the superhero cape and going, "Don't worry, nature, I got ya." But let's be real. The track record of us messing with ecosystems? Not exactly stellar. Maybe giving nature the wheel isn't a bad call this time. Like, we can keep an eye on things, maybe do some gentle nudging here and there, but full on bulldozing our way through? Maybe not the best move.
Man, Simon, that's a solid point. Overmanagement could just backfire on us, big time. It's like we don't have the best history of knowing when to back off and let nature handle its own business. Reminds me of when someone tries to fix a car with duct tape. Might hold for a minute, but probably not fixing much long term, right? Maybe it's better to be a spectator sometimes rather than jumping into the ring.
Ah, exactly, Joe. Duct tape on a car. Brilliant analogy. And it's like, if we keep acting like all we know nature experts, we might just do more harm than good. Just think about it. These places, like Chernobyl, have turned into bizarrely successful wildlife sanctuaries without much human help. Maybe those areas are kind of telling us, hey, chill out. We've got this. So maybe trusting nature's own comeback strategy isn't such a bad game plan after all?
Yeah, I totally get that, Simon. It's kind of like letting nature run its own experiment without us messing up the control group, right? Do you think there are specific things we should be monitoring then, just to make sure it's all going smoothly, like keeping track from a distance instead of barging in?
Oh, totally, Joe. Monitoring is key, like setting up wildlife cams instead of camping in their living room, right? We should be keeping an eye on the biodiversity levels, see which species are thriving or not, and check if there's any funky mutations happening. Just collecting data could help a lot. Like with Chernobyl, scientists found that some birds adapted by producing more antioxidants to fight radiation damage. It's like they're running their own little anti-radiation spa. That kind of subtle watch and learn approach can really show us nature's resilience and maybe even teach us a few survival tricks.
That's wild, Simon. Running their own little anti-radiation spa, huh? It's like these birds are not just surviving, they're figuring out how to thrive, maybe even setting up a little Zen garden on the side. But seriously, this kind of watching and learning from them could really open our eyes to new methods of dealing with radiation, not just for wildlife, but maybe for us too. What do you think about extending those lessons beyond just these zones?
Yeah, Joe, that's a brain tickler for sure. Extending lessons from these wildlife champs to human tech and healthcare? Intriguing, but I'm going to push back a tad here. While it's cool to marvel at bird antioxidants, turning that into something actionable for humans, we're talking about a huge leap. It's like trying to learn ballet from watching a football game. Entertaining, sure, but maybe not the most direct path to elegance, you know? Before we go dreaming of radiation-proof superhumans, which is a fun comic book plot, by the way, we might want to ground those high-flying ideas with some solid research stakes, making sure we're not just grabbing at scientific straws here.
Right you are, Simon. Leaping straight to superhuman ideas might be jumping the gun a bit, but like focusing on smaller, tangible lessons from these unexpected natural laboratories could still offer some golden nuggets. like studying how certain fungi in Chernobyl absorb radiation could inspire new materials or methods for radiation cleanup. That's less sci-fi and more grounded practical science. And besides just learning from these zones, there's still a heap to do in terms of ongoing research and data analysis to better understand these complex ecosystems. Like, we should keep tracking genetic changes and ecological shifts, not just for the cool factor, but to actually understand underlying mechanisms that could inform broader environmental strategies, you know? Staying rooted in rigorous, methodical science is key here, not just wild hypothesizing.
Joe, that's spot on. Focusing on those small nuggets of wisdom from nature's own lab, like how fungi absorb radiation, it's practical and kind of revolutionary without diving headfirst into sci-fi territory. Digging deeper into these mechanisms and changing our cleanup strategies, it makes total sense. And like with ongoing research, are we talking about setting up more permanent monitoring stations or something? Like a network of scientific outposts to keep the data flowing and providing real-time insights. That could be a game changer for both conservation efforts and tech innovations, don't you think?
Definitely, Simon. Setting up more permanent monitoring stations could provide consistent, valuable data. It's like creating a constant feedback loop from Mother Nature herself. Let's drill down on that idea. For example, researchers at Chernobyl have used remote sensing technology and drones to map out radioactive hotspots and monitor wildlife without disturbing the area. This non-invasive tech helps in understanding how radiation moves through ecosystems and affects various species differently. Plus, this approach can reveal patterns of recovery and resilience we might miss otherwise, like how some plant species have developed mechanisms to reduce radioactive uptake. Another point is, after the Fukushima disaster, scientists launched numerous projects to study the after effects, which included examining the migration habits of birds and other wildlife returning to the area. They discovered shifts in population dynamics and resilience strategies among different species, providing key insights into ecological recovery and adaptation. So yeah, implementing permanent stations and using advanced technologies not only aids immediate research goals, but also strengthens our overall approach to managing and possibly rehabilitating irradiated environments. What do you reckon about leveraging these tech advancements for better ecological management, Simon?
Oh man, Joe, that's tech meeting nature in a sci-fi epic waiting to happen. Imagine if these tech tools started picking up stuff we never even dreamed of, like discovering some critter that thrives on radiation and turns it into clean energy or something. That would flip the script on ecological disaster recovery.
That'd be nuts, Simon. It's like flipping the apocalypse into a utopia with critters as our little eco-warriors. What if we find more of these radiation-loving weirdos out there? This could change everything we thought we knew about survival and adaptation.
Totally, Joe. That would be like a total game changer, right? Imagine all the possibilities if we find more critters that could turn toxic stuff into something useful. It really turns the whole disaster into a weird kind of gold mine. What do you think, though? Could these funky creatures actually teach us new ways to handle environmental disasters?
Absolutely, Simon. If these critters can show us how to recycle disaster into something beneficial, that's a huge lesson in resilience and innovation. It just goes to show there's a lot more to learn from nature about bouncing back from the brink. What other secrets do you think are hiding out there, waiting to revolutionize our approach to ecological recovery?
Oh man, speaking of bouncing back from the brink, the resilience we see in nature could be like a blueprint for humans too, especially in those extreme post-disaster scenarios. So it kind of makes me wonder, Joe, if we were to face a drastic situation like a nuclear fallout, how would societies reconstruct themselves? Like, think about the gambling dens of makeshift governments popping up in all sorts of historical sieges or camps. What kind of wild, new governmental structures might emerge when faced with that level of crisis and scarcity, huh?
That's a heavy one, Simon. Seriously, looking back historically, in times of severe crises like sieges or long conflicts, people often revert to more immediate and local forms of governance. Power tends to decentralize. Smaller communities or groups take charge because larger established governments might be incapacitated. Take the siege of Sarajevo during the Bosnian War in the 90s. Communities had to self-organize to manage resources and defense. Or look at refugee camps today, where often camp committees are formed ad hoc by refugees themselves to manage day-to-day operations. Now extrapolate that to a post-nuclear scenario. You'd probably see a bunch of hyper-localized governing bodies popping up, prioritizing resource management and security. Leadership could lean towards individuals with survival skills or former military experience rather than traditional political figures, right? Norms would vastly shift towards more communal living practices, focusing on collective survival rather than individual gain. So, in a world where resources are scarce and populations are sparse, we might see a rise in a sort of neo-tribalism, where small groups govern themselves through consensus or a council of elders type setup instead of centralized government. Heck, it's like rewinding societal development, but with a twist. Adding our leftover technology into the mix could create some unique socio-political hybrids.
Oh man, that's a brain twister, Joe. Like mixing ancient tribal council vibes with whatever tech we've got left, a real-life sci-fi series playing out. What if these new tribes start competing or even trading tech secrets for resources? It'd be all sorts of chaotic and crafty.
Oh, spot on, Simon. Imagine the alliances and rivalries, like a high-stakes chess game where every move is about survival. Could totally transform how we view power and cooperation, huh?
Yeah, Joe, power dynamics in that sort of world might be totally upside down. It'd be less about who has the most money or followers and more about who can actually keep people safe and fed, right? Do you think these leaders would lean more on old school tactics, or are they going to have to invent brand new ways to keep peace and manage resources?
Oh, totally, Simon. In that scenario, leaders might need a mix of both old-school tactics and fresh strategies. The reliance on traditional leadership, like military-style command for security and order, is likely, but they'd also have to innovate radically in terms of resource management. Leaders could pioneer decentralized tech systems like blockchain to ensure equitable resource distribution without centralized power. That's new territory. There'd likely be a significant emphasis on renewable resources like solar or wind energy, creatively repurposed from whatever is salvageable. But it's not just about physical resources. Knowledge becomes a critical currency. Intergenerational skills, from farming to coding, would be invaluable in developing resilient communities. Education might shift towards practical skills essential for survival, diverging dramatically from current mainstream curricula focused on broader academic education. Culturally, there might be an interesting blend of nostalgic adherence to pre-fall customs and innovative cultural developments as communities seek to rebuild identity and social cohesion under radically different circumstances. This space between memory of the past and necessity of the present could create dynamic, possibly volatile, new societal structures. Leaders' roles would thus not only be tactical, but deeply cultural, steering collective memory and innovation.
Uh, you're hitting some wild points there, Joe, but I gotta poke at it a bit. Like thinking about using blockchain for resource distribution, that's tech savvy and all. But in a world that's just been knocked back to the Stone Age by nuclear fallout, are we really going to be able to rely on digital tech to save the day? I mean, sure, decentralized tech sounds fine and dandy when you've got stable electricity and a bunch of computer whizzes on hand. But throw in constant power outages and maybe a less tech-literate populace, then what? It feels like we might need to lean even harder on the old-school barter systems or something even more grassroots. Also, talking about preserving cultural identity and memory, that's crucial, right? But if everyday survival's at stake, how much bandwidth will people actually have to think about cultural preservation? Don't get me wrong, it's important, but it could turn into a luxury when you're more worried about where your next meal is coming from. So leaders might need to be like hyper-practical folks who are good with their hands, not just their heads. Someone who can rig up a wind turbine from scrap metal or turn a busted car into a water pump might be worth their weight in gold, way more than someone who can code. What do you think? Are we looking at a new type of leader altogether here?
Oh, absolutely, Simon. You're spot on about the indispensability of hands-on skills in that kind of scenario. It's less about Silicon Valley smarts and more about garage-style ingenuity. Leaders who can literally rebuild from the rubble would not just be valuable, they'd be vital. It paints a picture of a rugged, resourceful leader, kind of like a tech-savvy MacGyver meets Mad Max, doesn't it? What a shift in leadership archetypes that would be.
Oh, totally, Joe. It's like trading in your business suit for a tool belt and a soldering iron. From boardroom tactics to backyard tactics, complete game changer.
Yeah, Simon, it's like a total overhaul of what leader means. It might even throw the old power dynamics out the window. Do you think that this kind of shift could maybe lead to more egalitarian societies, or would it just create a different kind of hierarchy?
Oh, Joe, that's a chew on it question. It could go either way, right? Maybe we end up with a more hands on, everyone pulls their weight kind of egalitarian society, or we slide into a new sort of hierarchy where the folks who control the tech or the survival skills sit at the top. It's kind of like balancing on a tightrope, a wild ride waiting to happen. How do you think people would handle that transition?
Oh, Simon, speaking of wild rides and tightropes, it's not just about who handles the reins or tools. It's about keeping spirits up in face of despair, right? Speaking of which, humor seems to be one heck of a survival tool in those dire situations. Like, think about people historically using laughter to cope during wars or economic collapses. Humor can totally be a game changer, even in the darkest times. What do you think about its role when everything else seems to fall apart?
Totally, Joe. Laughter in those teeth clenching moments, it's priceless. Like, you've got total chaos around you, but if you can crack a joke, maybe it doesn't seem so grim. But then I gotta wonder, how much does laughing through the pain actually help? And when does it just turn into ignoring the real issues at hand? I mean, historically, soldiers in trenches or civilians during sieges, they told jokes to keep morale up, right? It helps, no doubt, keeps you human. But relying on humor, sometimes I think it could just be slapping a band-aid on a bullet wound. What if instead of always going for a laugh, we faced our feelings head on more often? Or am I just being a downer here, and we really do need that comic relief to survive?
Oh, that's a deep cut there, Simon. I get it. Using humor does seem like slapping a band-aid on sometimes. But think about it. Laughter isn't just about ignoring the harsh realities. It's more like a way for us to process them in doses we can handle. Like maybe it's not so much hiding from our problems as it is giving us a momentary breather, you know? When every day is a struggle, a little humor can be like a pressure valve. Sure, you got to face the music at some point, but personally, I think those laughs are what keep you ready to face another day fighting and not just folding. It's almost like basic human survival tech. Doesn't fix everything, sure, but it makes it all a bit more bearable without going full breakdown mode. It's about balance, really. You laugh off what you can and deal seriously with what you need to. What do you think, Simon? Are we underestimating the power of a good chuckle, or is it genuinely just a temporary escape hatch?
Hey folks, just tuning in. We're diving into how crucial humor can be, as a survival tool when the going gets tough. Basically, we're chewing over whether cracking jokes is just us ducking under a cozy blanket of denial, or if it's actually a legit way to, cope with all the crazy stuff life throws our way. Joe makes a solid point here about laughter acting kind of like a pressure valve, gives us a break from the constant grind. It's almost like when everything's falling apart, finding something to laugh about might keep us sane and ready when things are, downright bleak. This isn't just about ignoring the bad stuff. Nope. It's more like handling it with a bit of grace, you know? Mixing in laughs with the serious stuff to make sure we don't fully lose it. Really, who doesn't need a good giggle fit even when things look grim? That's what we're hashing out here.
Absolutely, Simon. And hey, imagine the kind of jokes you'd hear in a post-apocalyptic comedy club. What does a radioactive chicken cross the road? It's dark humor for sure, but maybe that's just the ticket when the world's gone sideways. Keeps everyone bonded and grounded, right?
Oh, Joe, that's a hilarious image right there, like a bunch of scruffy survivors laughing it up in a bunker turned comedy club. But you got to think there's something super intriguing about why we even find that dark humor funny, right? Is it because we're all a little twisted, or is it because we know deep down that things could always be worse? Imagine the jokes. Why did the radioactive chicken cross the road? To mutate on the other side. I mean, yeah, it's morose, but laughter kind of glues us together when everything else is breaking apart. It's this shared knowing nod like, life's tough, but hey, we're still kicking. Keeps the spirit alive against the odds. But then again, does leaning too much into that kind of humor make us overlook the real hardships folks are facing? Like, where do you draw the line between keeping spirits high and just masking the pain with punchlines? Could we be, I don't know, accidentally minimizing how genuinely rough it is for people? What's your take, Joe? Is there such a thing as going too far with our laughs when we're knee deep in crisis mode?
Oh man, Simon, that's like hitting the nail on the head. There's definitely a thin line there. Using humor, especially the dark kind, it's like a coping mechanism, right? Helps us to kind of digest the undigestible by wrapping it in laughter. And yeah, it does keep morale up when everything looks bleak. But here's where it gets tricky. Just because we're laughing doesn't mean the problems vanish. It's like if we laugh too much, maybe we start seeing things through these humor-tinted glasses, which isn't always helpful. There's this balance, we gotta find it, between acknowledging the real pain and still finding moments to laugh despite it all. So, do we ever go too far with jokes in crisis? Yeah, probably sometimes, but I think as long as our intentions are good, to relieve stress and bond over shared struggles, it might be okay. It's about reading the room, you know? Like recognizing when people need a joke to lighten the mood and when they just need to feel heard and understood without the punchlines. What do you think, Simon?
Oh, for sure, Joe. It's like walking a tightrope. You slip too far one side, it's pure despair. Too far the other, and you're just laughing off danger. Keeping that balance? That's the real art of survival humor. Makes me wonder, if we had historical figures in those intense moments cracking jokes, how differently would we view bravery or even history itself?
Absolutely, Simon. And speaking of keeping history alive, how about we jump into how cultures might preserve or even reinvent their heritage after a cataclysm? Imagine, 300 years post-nuclear event. What elements of today's culture do you think would stick around, and what new forms of art might emerge from the ashes?
Wow, Joe, that's a brain tickler for sure. Picture this 300 years clear of a nuclear doomsday, and folks are mingling old world charms with, let's call it nuclear renaissance art. Like maybe classics from Shakespeare to the Beatles get folded into new traditions, kind of like how Station 11 showcases traveling symphonies keeping Shakespeare alive post collapse. But then you've also got room for fresh voices who might weave in tales or tunes about their ancestors braving the fallout or something. What jumps out at me is how art could really become this patchwork of pre and post nuclear life. It's not just hanging on to the past, it's sort of showing us how much we've adapted, right? One aspect that I'm really curious about, though, Joe, is which bits of our art and literature today do you think would resonate with people so far in the future? Like what sticks through an apocalypse?
That's a fascinating point, Simon. I think like deeply human and universal themes, love, courage, survival, they're going to stick no matter what. Stories or music that touch on these core experiences, they're timeless. Take something as old as the Tales of Odyssey from Homer, right? It's about a journey, facing hardships, clinging to hope. Even post-apocalypse, such stories would still find an echo in like the hearts of those living through their own real-life odysseys. Musically, I could see people gravitating towards stuff with like a raw emotional punch, think blues or even some classic rock. These genres carry a weight, that could really speak to folks rebuilding from scratch. They're not just tunes, they feel like anthems for enduring and overcoming. But also, there's going to be this huge space for new expressions, maybe digital art forms using salvaged tech, or perhaps theater that incorporates the reality of living in a recovered world. It's kind of like art growing directly out of the debris, showing not just recovery, but a rebirth of culture. What do you think, Simon? How much do you see our current cultural forms evolving post-disaster?
Oh, Joe, you're spot on with that living through their own real-life odysseys bit. Makes me imagine a world where digital graffiti might be the new cave paintings, stories of survival etched in VR or something. Like, not just evolving art forms, but totally transforming them to fit a narrative defined by resilience. Wouldn't that be something? Just think how these digital fossils might someday tell our descendants about our tenacity and creativity amidst chaos. How do you see technology shaping post-apocalyptic art, man?
Oh man, Simon, thinking about digital graffiti as the new age cave paintings is wild. Imagine future archaeologists digging through data instead of dirt. But seriously, tech is going to turbocharge creativity after a catastrophic event. We might see art that not only entertains but also serves functional purposes, like interactive maps or educational tools built into storytelling methods. It's like merging survival with expression. This blend could lead to a whole new era where art isn't just seen or heard, but experienced in ways we can barely imagine now.
Whoa, Joe, that's like turning survival into an art form itself. Can you imagine interactive post-apocalyptic survival guides disguised as street theater? Talk about engaging.
Hey everyone, just tuning in. I'm Joe, and alongside Simon here, we've been chewing over this cool idea of like crafting tomorrow's heritage. You know, how culture might evolve or preserve itself after something as massive as a nuclear event. We're talking about blending old world arts like Shakespeare or the Beatles with new expressions maybe born from post-apocalyptic experiences. Things like digital graffiti, which could be akin to future cave paintings. We also dove into how art forms could shift, evolving, or kind of transforming to incorporate both survival and interactive elements, making them super engaging. Like imagine street theater that's not only entertaining, but doubles as a survival guide. It's all about finding ways to cling onto our roots while boldly stepping into new ways of expressing our shared human experiences. So cool, right?
Yeah, totally cool, Joe. But here's a twist. What if in the midst of trying to preserve old arts, we inadvertently start smudging the lines? Like imagine taking something pure and classic, say Beethoven, and remixing it with sounds sampled from post-nuclear echoes or something. Some might argue we're preserving culture. Others could yelp that we're mangling it. Plus, think about this. Might some old forms just not translate well into a new world context? Like, would complex ballet make sense in a society where physical expression might be more about utility than form? There's a balance between tradition and practicality, and sometimes, I reckon, what was profound at one time could end up as just perplexing post-apocalypse. We'd have to really think through what we carry forward and why. What's your take, Joe? Are we risking losing the soul of these arts in our bid to hold on to them?
That's a legit concern, Simon. Often the line between preserving and transforming can get blurry, you know? Maybe blending something like Beethoven with post-nuclear sounds could either breathe new life into it or distance us from its origins. It's kind of a tightrope walk, keeping true to the core while evolving to stay relevant. It really opens up a broad dialogue about authenticity versus innovation in post-apocalyptic culture preservation. Like, how much change is too much before something essential is lost? And yet, if we don't adapt, do these cultural relics even have a place in a radically changed world? Plenty to chew on there, huh? What do you all think?
Oh, switching gears for a sec. How about we dive into something super out there? Picture this. Chernobyl, right? Post-nuclear disaster zone turned accidental nature lab. Imagine all the wild, mutant critters and plants that are twisting evolution's arm out there.
Absolutely, Simon. Chernobyl has become this unexpected epicenter of a kind of rapid evolution experiment. When the disaster struck back in 1986, it left behind a zone so radioactively charged that people had to abandon it, right? But nature just kept punching the clock. What's wild is that scientists have observed an array of genetic changes over the years. For example, some birds in the area developed brighter plumage, and others actually showed changes in their brain chemistry that could help them navigate the radioactive landscape. And then there are the trees. Some have a pigment change in their bark, possibly a protective mechanism against radiation absorption. And here's another kicker. Insects around Chernobyl have developed mutations that may increase their resistance to radiation. So, while the initial fears were all about malformed creatures and dead zones, what we're seeing is some species adapting in ways that might even be considered beneficial for survival in such harsh conditions. It raises those big questions. What does adaptation look like in extreme environments? Could these mutations ever benefit organisms if similar conditions were faced elsewhere on the globe? It's pretty out there to think about. What do you make of that, Simon?
Whoa, Joe, that's like Mother Nature hitting the hard mode button and these critters just leveling up. Makes you wonder, are we looking at tomorrow's superheroes or what?
It's a wild thought, Simon. Like, these critters could be the blueprint for future super species, right? But, on the flip side, there's something kind of unsettling about calling them superheroes. I mean, these mutations, they're not really popping up because the environment is blooming or thriving in a traditional sense, right? It's more like survival mode on steroids. Yeah, they're adapting, but it's under extreme stress and sheer necessity rather than natural progression. Like, let's consider, if radiation-induced changes are pushing evolution in significant ways, what does that mean for the balance of ecosystems? Could these advantages eventually lead to some species dominating over others, or even causing new types of environmental imbalances? So, while the superhero tag is cool and all, it might gloss over the reality of these adaptations being potentially problematic signs of environmental distress rather than just marvels of nature. What's your perspective on the bigger ecological impact here, Simon?
Oh, bang on, Joe. It's like putting duct tape on a leaky pipe. Sure, it holds back the flood for now, but ain't exactly fixing the underlying plumbing issue, right? What if these rad-resisting critters start throwing wild parties in the gene pool and suddenly, bam, the neighborhood's never the same?
Yeah, exactly, Simon. You hit the nail right on the head. It's kind of like we're dealing with a band-aid solution in an evolving crisis, not really addressing the core issue. And about those rad-resisting critters mixing it up in the gene pool, there's this real concern about long-term consequences. So think about it. These mutations help them survive now, which is great. But if they start dominating, it can shift what the ecosystem looks like entirely. Like, maybe some plants and animals that used to thrive are now outcompeted by these super adaptive species. It might sound okay at first glance, but there's potential for unchecked changes to lead to ecological imbalances, where only the mutants thrive, pushing out native species, changing how nutrients cycle, or even altering the physical environment itself. And here's another angle, like the broader implications of such adaptive traits. Could they somehow escape Chernobyl? Imagine these genetically tweaked organisms spreading beyond radioactive areas into more standard environments. That could seriously stir things up, dramatically impacting global biodiversity. So while it's fascinating from a scientific viewpoint, it's also somewhat alarming considering the possible shifts in our global ecological fabric. What kind of measures or monitoring do you think would be necessary to keep tabs on these developments, Simon?
Oh man, it's like we need a wildlife version of the TSA, tracking and screening who gets in and out of the gene pool.
Yeah, Simon, a wildlife TSA, what a concept. Keeping tabs on genetic travelers could really help manage those unexpected ecological shifts. Makes you think, huh? What would that look like in practice, tracking all that wild genetic data?
Yeah, Joe, you're spot on with that idea of a wildlife TSA. Tracking the genetic shifts in real time sounds like a giant task, but super necessary, right? It's kind of fascinating to think about how technology could be leveraged here, like maybe using satellite tech or some advanced biosensors out in the wild to monitor changes. But do you think there's a risk of like invading the natural habitat too much with all that tech? How do we balance keeping an eye out without stepping too hard on Mother Nature's toes?
Oh, absolutely, Simon. You're spot on about using tech like satellites and biosensors. It's kind of exciting to consider the possibilities, right? But then again, tossing too much tech into these natural habitats, Isn't that just swapping one form of invasion for another? There's definitely a real conundrum in balancing the tech intrusion with environmental observation. So, if we're serious about not stepping too hard on Mother Nature's toes, maybe there's a way to integrate less invasive methods. Like, think about this. Could we maybe use drones that blend more naturally into the environment? Or what about deploying technology that's only active during certain times to reduce constant disturbances? And then, hold up, there's also the ethical question about how much right we even have to meddle, even if it's for conservation. It's kind of tricky because while we want to safeguard these ecosystems from going haywire, we also need to respect their natural processes. It's a bit of a sticky wicket, don't you think? How far do you reckon we should go with all this, Simon?
Oh man, Joe. It's like we're trying to be nature's helicopter parents with all this tech, hovering around too much, trying to control every last bit. Maybe those animals are just out there thinking, chill out, humans. Let me mutate in peace. Can't we just send them a nice fruit basket and call it a day?
You're kind of right about that helicopter parent vibe, Simon. We do get overly hands-on sometimes. But letting them mutate in peace might sound chill, but that could let things spiral out of control without us noticing until it's like way too late, right? So even though setting up a full surveillance state over nature seems extreme, we kind of need some level of oversight to ensure these mutations aren't leading to ecological disasters. Like, think about invasive species. We didn't keep an eye on many of them early on, and look where that's got us in some places. Monitoring doesn't have to be obtrusive. It could be super nuanced, just enough to help us understand and react appropriately without freaking out the wildlife. Plus, staying informed helps everyone, not just scientists but everyday folks, appreciate the subtle shifts happening in our environment. It's all about crafting a balance that respects both nature's autonomy and our responsibility as its stewards. Doesn't that seem like a better route, keeping tabs without going full Big Brother?
Oh, totally, Joe. It's like we're trying to follow a nature reality show without becoming those creepy paparazzi. Just enough sneak peeks to keep us all clued in and not sleepwalk into an ecological facepalm. What's the next wild chapter nature's gonna write, huh?
Speaking of ecological facepalms and surprises, have you heard about those glowing forests near nuclear fallout zones? Yeah, it sounds like sci-fi, but some trees actually show bioluminescence. It's a mind-boggling phenomenon that kicks our understanding of mutation up another notch.
Glowing forests, Joe? That's nuts, but are we sure it's not just some local teens with glow sticks having a rave? All right, jokes aside. I've got to press pause, though. Could this whole bioluminescent tree story be getting more hype than actual science backs up? Honestly, while radiation does wacky things, attributing spunky night glow to nuclear effects might stretch it. Bioluminescence in nature usually links to organisms like fungi, which are known to emit light thanks to their own biochemistry, right? So maybe these radiated trees got themselves a funky fungal infection rather than mutating into natural lamps. Plus, considering how experimental and new this area is, it feels like we're maybe jumping to conclusions without solid proof yet. We gotta tread carefully before calling it the forest disco, without understanding the role of other environmental factors or organisms contributing to these neon vibes. What do you think, swapping mutation theories for a potentially groovier fungal narrative?
Oh man, Simon, that's a solid point. It does sound more like something out of Comic-Con with those glowing reviews. Jumping straight to radiation as the neon light switch might be stretching it without the hard science to back it up. You're right. Could totally be these fungi working their biomagical glow, living off the trees, rather than the trees turning into glow sticks themselves. I mean, Mother Nature's got her own bag of tricks, and fungus among us showing off like that. It isn't new. Makes you think we should maybe lean on established science before getting caught up in the sci-fi of it all. But dude, imagine if we've stumbled onto some kind of symbiotic freak show between the fallout effects and forest fungi. We gotta keep peeling this onion to see what's actually cooking beneath these glowing reports. What's your take on dragging some specialists into our next chat to shed some serious lumens on this mystery?
Oh man, Joe, That idea is hotter than a campfire. Pulling in some brainy fungus aficionados could really light up the whole convo. Let's dig into the science and sort out if we're dealing with radioactive raves or just some flashy fungi having a woodland party.
Wow, Simon, pulling in experts to dive into this glowing forest mystery. That's a stellar move. Getting the lowdown straight from the mushroom masters themselves could really unravel whether we've got some radioactive tree disco or just fungi throwing their own kind of light show. Seriously, the whole bioluminescence thing is blowing my mind. Like, if it's the fungi, that's cool and all, but imagine if there's an actual link to the radiation. That would be like nature pulling a phoenix move, something beautiful emerging from the ashes of nuclear fallout. Definitely a saga worth exploring with those in the know. Yeah, let's get this sorted. Either way, whether it's funky fungi or radiant trees, this is one heck of a natural phenomenon. And can you imagine how this could change our understanding of ecological resilience?
Yeah, Joe, that phoenix metaphor's killer. Rising from the nuclear ashes, it's poetic for sure, but like we gotta pump the brakes a bit. If this glitz is really from radiation, isn't there potentially a darker side to this beauty? Like, what if this illuminating effect, while cool on the surface, actually signals some deeper environmental distress? We often cheer for resilience and adaptation, right? But insert an ominous soundtrack here, because adapting to radiation isn't the start of an eco-friendly Marvel movie. It's gnarly stuff. This whole phenomenon could be Mother Nature's SOS flare. Pretty alarming. So before we throw the welcome party for these glowing forests, let's get those experts in and really dissect whether this light show is a badge of honor or a cry for help. What do you say? Ready to shine a flashlight into this ecological enigma and see what scuttles out?
Yeah, Simon, you're absolutely spot on. This whole glowing spectacle could totally be more than just a visual treat. It might actually be a major environmental alarm bell. When we praise these adaptations, it's like cheering in a horror movie when the protagonist finds a place to hide, not realizing the danger isn't over. So, bringing experts into our chat, definitely a smart move. We need to peel back the layers here and pinpoint what's driving this phenomenon. Is it a natural wonder or a warning sign? Because while bioluminescence can be naturally beautiful, if it's tied to radiation effects, that beauty could mask something pretty grave. And let's not forget, how does this affect everything else living in those forests, right? There's a whole ecosystem at play. If trees start radioactively glowing, what does that mean for habitat stability, species diversity, heck, even local human communities? Yeah, Simon, shining a proper flashlight on this is crucial. Let's grab some fungal experts, maybe a couple of radiation biologists, and really dive deep into whether this glow is an ecological thumbs up or a serious distress signal. This could reshape how we look at recovery and resilience in nature.
Oh, totally, Joe. And imagine if this leads to discovering some sort of super fungi that not only glows, but maybe, just maybe, it could start breaking down pollutants or radiation. Talking about turning a potential horror movie into a superhero saga. Man, I'm all pumped up for our next deep dive with those experts. What a twist that would be, huh?
Oh man, Simon, that's an epic twist. Imagine harnessing glowing super fungi for environmental cleanup missions. Let's gear up for this deep dive. It could be a game changer in how we tackle pollution and radiation. The possibilities are just mind-blowing.
Yeah, Joe, the super fungi angle is wild. But let's not get too ahead of ourselves, right? Pulling back a bit, even though the idea of glow-in-the-dark cleanup crews sounds like blockbuster material, we gotta wonder, what's the real story behind these glowing reports? Like, before we chase down this superhero dream, shouldn't we be asking if buffering up fungi to handle radiation is, like, actually feasible? Or could it mess with the ecological balance even more? There's this tricky line between innovation and, potential ecological disruption. A solid brainstorm with those experts might just save us from turning into accidental villains in this saga. What if, instead of fixing problems, we're kind of creating new ones without realizing? Super important to keep grounded, don't you think?
Absolutely, Simon. Keeping it grounded is crucial. We definitely need to sort out the dazzle from the potentially dangerous with a thorough chat with those experts. Delving deep into this glowing mystery could unearth some revolutionary insights or reveal cautionary tales. Either way, it seems like there's a whole lot more beneath the surface of these luminous forests, ready to kick off a fascinating chapter for all of us to explore.
You know, Joe, talking about these glowing mysteries and potentials kind of flips the horror script on its head, right? It makes me think about other weird and wacky mutations out there. Nature's not just throwing us curveballs. Sometimes it feels like she's pitching a whole sci-fi series. Have you seen some of these hilarious mutant forms popping up post-nuclear events? We're living in a real-life comic strip with these quirky natural adaptations.
Oh, Simon, seriously? Like nature's own sci-fi creations. That's hilarious. Are we talking full-on cartoon character vibes here? Because imagining a forest full of glowing trees and funky-looking animals sounds just, I don't know, wildly entertaining. What kinds of quirky mutant forms are popping up? This could definitely add a lighter twist to our usually serious convos.
Oh, Joe, you wouldn't believe the kinds of oddballs nature's churned out. But, let's not get too carried away thinking all mutations are cute and harmless, right? Some of these changes are downright bizarre. There's this one bird species that developed a fluorescent beak. Looks like it smashed into a highlighter pen or something. And then there's a deer with an extra set of antlers growing from, I kid you not, its forehead. Looks like something straight out of a fantasy novel. But seriously, while it's easy to chuckle at these sci-fi critters, each quirky trait has a story, a real-life explanation involving genetics, survival, maybe even a dash of accidental radiation spice. It's like nature's not just goofing around, there's science behind the sitcom. Plus, I'm curious how experts explain these slapstick features without losing their scientific cool. This stuff is gold for lightening up our chat, don't you think? What about drawing in listeners to imagine their own mutant creatures? Could be a hoot seeing what wild ideas they come up with.
Absolutely, Simon. You've really got to wonder what else nature has up its sleeve. Those mutations, fluorescent beaks and extra antlers, it's like the animal kingdom's own special effects department run wild. I'm all in for diving deeper, sharing these bizarre tales with our listeners, and hearing their craziest mutant creature ideas. This stuff not only entertains, but shines a light on the amazing adaptability and unpredictability of nature. Who knows what other comedic gold we might dig up next?
Oh, Joe, diving into these weird and wacky mutations got me thinking, like really chewing on something bigger here. We're grabbing a front row seat to nature's own sci-fi spectacle, right? But it kind of begs the question, should we just keep our popcorn ready and watch this show go on? Or do we have a role to play? Like, what's our move when nature pulls these freaky adaptations? Step in and help steer the ship? Or let evolution's wild ride do its thing?
That's the big question, isn't it, Simon? It's like being between a rock and a hard place. Historically, human interventions in ecosystems, think invasive species control or breeding programs, sometimes pan out but often backfire. Look at the introduction of cane toads in Australia meant for pest control, and boom, they became the pests. Then there's the Chernobyl exclusion zone, where ironically, wildlife has flourished since humans left, despite the radiation. That kind of suggests maybe stepping back isn't always bad. And scientifically, sometimes these mutations might lead to beneficial adaptations, species that can survive new challenges. But meddling could potentially harm those processes, introducing unforeseen complications. So it's this delicate balance, right? Do we try to correct the course, risking unintended consequences, or watch from the sidelines, possibly witnessing a new kind of natural selection at play? What ethical responsibilities do we hold here as part human, part caretaker in this global ecosystem?
Oh, Joe, this is like being the director of a nature documentary where the script writes itself and we're still debating whether to yell cut or just let the cameras roll. It's thrilling, but nerve-wracking. What if Mother Nature's onto something brilliant with these tweaks, despite how bizarre they look? Shouldn't we at least consider that maybe she's got the director's chair for a reason?
Yeah, Simon, that's a killer point. But think about it. Mother Nature isn't just some genius sitting back and casually tweaking DNA for the better. There's no real intent behind these mutations. They're random, and while some might be beneficial, others could be disastrous in the long run. And consider human intervention history. Yeah, we've messed up big time sometimes. But doesn't that also offer us a unique perspective on when and how to step in effectively? Learning from past mistakes to guide our decisions, taking responsibility where we've already influenced changes. So here's a thought. What if our role is more like that of a guardian rather than a director or a mere spectator? Engaging actively but cautiously, ensuring that what evolves under our watch doesn't turn into the next invasive species disaster or ecological imbalance. Isn't there some merit to guiding processes that we've inadvertently set into motion?
Oh man, Joe, you've hit the philosopher king level here. But let's stir the pot a bit. Imagine if by playing Guardian, we accidentally supercharge these mutations. Like turning a garden lizard into Godzilla because we thought we were helping. The plot thickens, huh? What then?
Oh, you're really putting the drama into it, Simon. It reminds me of something a bit closer to home, like not Godzilla scale, but still pretty wild. I was involved in this community project, right? We were trying to revitalize this local pond, thought introducing some non-native plants would boost the aquatic life. Seemed simple enough, good intentions and all that. But man, did it backfire. Those plants turned invasive so quick, choked out the local flora, disrupted the whole ecosystem balance. Took us years to correct that mistake, and it was a real eye-opener. So, your point about accidentally turning lizards into Godzillas isn't so far off. Even small interventions can ripple out wildly unexpected effects. Makes you think twice about how we handle Mother Nature's unpredictable adaptations, doesn't it? Just shows how nuanced our role has to be in this whole ecological direction.
Totally, Joe, like it's a fine line. We think we're doing good, then bam, nature throws a curveball. Makes you wonder if there's ever a right way to intervene without tipping the scales too much, huh?
Yeah, Simon, it's like trying to play chess with nature, right? Every move we make, even with the best of intentions, can lead to outcomes we never saw coming. Makes me think, are we really equipped to make these calls? Given how complex ecosystems are, it's almost arrogant to think we can engineer them without side effects. So here's a curveball for you. Maybe instead of asking if we should intervene, we need better tools or methods to predict and understand the consequences before we act. What do you think? Could tech advancements help us become more nuanced environmental stewards, or is that just opening another Pandora's box?
Joe, that's a heavy hitter there. You're like really onto something with the whole tech thing. Could it? Yeah, potentially. Technology could offer us those super detailed simulations, right? Predicting outcomes before we even make a move. That sounds slick. But then you got to wonder, are we just swapping one Pandora's box for another? Like more tech means more stuff to manage and possibly mess up? What do you think, man? Can we trust ourselves to handle these tools any better than past interventions?
Yeah, Simon, you're dead on about using tech to predict outcomes. Sounds great in theory, right? But here's the rub. Can we trust ourselves to use this new toolkit responsibly? History's kind of stacked with examples where better tools didn't lead to wiser decisions. Like, look at industrial advancements that led to faster deforestation and more effective hunting techniques, pushing species toward extinction. And let's be real, tech's not infallible. Advanced models and simulations rely on data, the right data, and interpreting it correctly. They're tools created by humans, meaning they carry our biases, errors, and blind spots. So no matter how slick the technology gets, there always remains a significant margin for uncertainty and error. Calls into question whether more control is actually better, doesn't it? Now throw in the complexities of ecosystems, DNA mutations, evolutionary paths. It's like trying to understand the entire internet by looking at one web page. Maybe what we need isn't just cooler software, but rather a shift in our approach. Humility over hubris, observation, and gradual change instead of swift intervention. What are your thoughts on taking that slower, more cautious route?
Oh boy, Joe, that's like asking us to swap our power tools for a magnifying glass and tweezers, right? Literal small moves. Makes the whole thing not just a science problem, but a real philosophical puzzle. Are we treading lightly enough? Or are we still trying to play superhero in a world that maybe just needs more thoughtful caretakers?
Yeah, Simon, the superhero versus caretaker debate. It really hits home. Reminds me of this one time, a few years back, I volunteered with a local conservation group, right? We were tasked with restoring this old forest area, kind of return it to its original glory. But here's the twist. We started with all these ambitious plans, planting new trees, adding pathways, setting up protection measures against pests, everything by the book to fast-track the forest's revival. But nature had other ideas. Like some trees we planted just didn't take. Wrong soil type, unexpected fungal infections, things we hadn't factored in despite our good intentions and advanced tools. Over time, we learned that smaller, more considered interventions worked better. Watching closely, adapting methods based on what the forest seemed to need, not just what our manuals suggested. It was slow, sometimes frustrating, but amazingly instructive. This whole experience kind of parallels our current discussion, like whether to go big and bold, trying to control nature's course, or take that magnifying glass approach, tuning into subtler cues from the environment. Makes you wonder if the best way forward is actually sprinkled with more patience than power, huh?
Absolutely, Joe. It's like we're part of a reality TV show, but with Mother Nature as the unpredictable star. What plot twist will she throw at us next? Patience might just be our best strategy to ensure we don't end up being the villains of our own show.
Speaking of patience and not playing the villain, Simon, it's cool how that concept ties into other areas where humans have harnessed nature for healing rather than harm. Like in bioremediation, using biological means to clean up our messes, right? Literally using nature to heal nature. It's this inspiring corner of science where we can see real progress without forcing our hand too much. What do you think about diving into that a bit? How these biological heroes are turning waste into wonders?
Oh, totally, Joe. Bioremediation sounds like a superhero team up, but with microbes and plants instead of caped crusaders, right? It's wild to think about. You've got these tiny organisms and plants basically munching away on pollutants, breaking them down into harmless substances. But here's my skeptic hat going on. While it sounds perfect, aren't we kind of just sitting back hoping nature will clean up our industrial messes? Like, take phytoremediation. You plant certain trees and bam, they suck up heavy metals from the soil. Awesome, right? But doesn't this make you wonder, are we leaning too much on nature again to fix problems? What about preventing pollution in the first place? And not all sites are treatable with these techniques, so it's not a one-size-fits-all solution. What's your take on balancing this let nature handle it approach with more direct, maybe even technological interventions?
Simon, you've nailed a critical point. While bioremediation is like having an environmental cleanup crew, it's not the magic bullet. You're right. Relying solely on these methods can sometimes feel like a convenient excuse to avoid tackling the root causes of pollution. Take phytoremediation. It's amazing for certain pollutants like metals and some organics, but totally ineffective against others, like deeply buried waste or highly toxic contaminants that could harm the plants themselves. And while these green technologies are compelling, they indeed don't fit every scenario. So, here's the thing. Coupling these natural processes with proactive technological oversight might be our best bet. Imagine integrating real-time soil and water sensors with phytoremediation sites to monitor effectiveness and make adjustments on the fly. That kind of hybrid approach, blending biological processes with smart tech, could help us manage these projects more dynamically and responsibly, ensuring we're not just dumping problems on nature's shoulders.
That's like giving nature a smartwatch, Joe, monitoring its health in real time to make sure it keeps flexing those cleanup muscles effectively. It's kind of making the best of both worlds, huh? Nature gets to do its thing, and we back it up with some high-tech love to keep things on track. What a tag team.
Exactly, Simon. It's all about striking that balance. Reminds me of this time I was on a hiking trip, right? We stumbled upon this old mine, kind of eerie and definitely not in use anymore. My buddy, he's sort of an environmental geek. He tells me the soil's probably loaded with toxins. But just nearby, there was this area teeming with new plant life. And guess what? They were using it as a pilot site for phytoremediation. And here's where it gets interesting. These folks had set up systems to monitor the health of the plants and the progression of soil quality over time. Kind of like giving nature that smartwatch you mentioned. It wasn't just let's plant some stuff and hope for the best. They were actively observing how effective these plants were at drawing out toxins. It really drove home the fact that when we're intelligently supporting these natural processes with technology, we aren't just sitting back and hoping for miracles. We're part of the process, ensuring that the effort's directed and effective. Like we're facilitating this awesome natural cleanup squad, tuning in closely to provide whatever backup is needed, fleshing out that dynamic, responsive role we can play. It feels like genuine teamwork with nature, you know?
Whoa, nature's cleanup crew, plus our tech tools. It's like turning every polluted site into a nerd plant tag team battlefield. Talk about an underdog story.
Ah, yeah, it does sound like an underdog story for the ages. But here's a counterpoint worth chewing on, Simon. While integrating tech with nature's processes seems brilliant, there's this side of the coin that suggests we could be over-relying on these bioremediation efforts, right? So, consider this. Every site has its unique challenges and complexities. Bioremediation isn't always predictable. Different pollutants, soil types, climates, they all play a massive role in influencing outcomes. And sometimes the microbial or plant-based treatment doesn't work as planned because these factors weren't adequately accounted for. Plus, there's this risk of transferring pollutants from one medium to another, like from soil to air through volatilization during phytoremediation, right? It doesn't really eliminate the contaminant, just moves the problem elsewhere, which could potentially introduce new environmental health risks. Ensuring sustainable and effective cleanup often demands more comprehensive, conventional methods in conjunction with, or even sometimes instead of bioremediation. Like dredging polluted sediments or containing contaminants might be necessary to guarantee safety before letting plants and microbes do their thing. So, while it's super tempting to champion bio-nerd teams as the ultimate solution, it's crucial, I think, to maintain a broader perspective that considers both the powers and the limits of these natural helpers. What's your take on managing these expectations and not seeing bioremediation as a silver bullet?
You're hitting the nail on the head, Joe. It's like giving a kid a superhero cape and telling him to clean his room. Sure, he's eager, but can he really tackle every mess? We gotta know when to step in with the big guns, or maybe even a dustpan.
You know, Simon, speaking of stepping in with the big guns or a dustpan in ecosystem cleanups, It really brings us to another critical junction: ethics. When we talk about interventions like bioremediation or any heavier engineering fixes, aren't we kind of playing God with these ecosystems? It's not just about whether we can clean up effectively, but if we should even restore these areas to their original states or attempt to create something entirely new. So, picture this scenario: a conversation between a conservation biologist and an industrial developer. They're duking it out over how to balance pushing economic growth with the need to preserve or responsibly manage our ecological assets. Like, the biologist might argue for minimal interference to let nature heal on its own terms, while the developer could be pushing for aggressive restoration methods to quickly bring an area back to usable standards. It sparks this huge ethical debate, right? Whether our attempts at restoration are truly helping, or if they're simply imposing human desires over natural processes. What's your take on navigating these murky waters?
Ah, Joe, this is like trying to decide whether to give a haircut or just let your hair grow wild, right? On one hand, the biologist's point about letting nature do its thing has got that gentle, Zen vibe. It's patient, trusting nature's own wisdom. But then, bam, here comes Mr. Developer with his blueprints and deadlines, arguing we've got tech and brains, so why not speed up the process? Here's where it gets sticky, like bubblegum in your hair kind of sticky. If we rush in and reshape these ecosystems without fully understanding the implications, are we risking even more damage? Toys come with instruction manuals, but ecosystems sure don't. Plus, who's to say the new version we build is any better than what would have evolved if we just stepped back a bit? So yeah, navigating this, it's like balancing on a tightrope while juggling grenades. We need dialogue, robust ethical frameworks, and maybe a big old dose of humility to admit we might not always know best. What tools do you think we need in our ethical toolkit to handle these scenarios responsibly?
Absolutely, Simon. It's a tightrope walk indeed. Hey, here's a thought. What if we treated these ecosystems like a chess game? Every move has long-term consequences and needs careful strategy. Not just rushing the pawns forward, but thinking several moves ahead could help us avoid those grenade-like slip-ups, right?
Absolutely, Joe. Chess, not checkers. That's the mindset we need for sure. Hey, folks, that's a wrap on today's edition of Infinite Podcast. Huge thanks to all our listeners for tuning in and going deep with us into the wild world of ecology and ethics. Don't forget, bring your pawns and your best game face back here tomorrow at 5 p.m. Eastern. You won't want to miss what we've got lined up next. Stay curious, keep questioning, and always play smart. Catch you on the next wave, everyone.
Oh, and one last nugget to chew on. What if nature has its own game plan we haven't yet decoded? See you tomorrow to unravel more mysteries.